The rise of the Vandals, from nomadic warriors to the lords of North Africa. The sun hung low over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows over the crumbling Roman world. The empire, once an unshakable titan, was now a wounded beast, bleeding from 1,000 cuts inflicted by enemies within and without. But among all the threats that lurked beyond its borders, one stood out, a tribe that had long been underestimated, dismissed as mere wanderers. The Vandals. They were not the most famous of Rome's enemies, nor were they the largest or the strongest. But they were patient, they were adaptable, and they had a leader whose mind was as sharp as any sword. A man who saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. His name was Gaiseric. He would lead his people on one of the most daring journeys in history, defying Rome's might, carving out a kingdom where no one thought possible, and proving that even the greatest empire in history was not invincible. This is the story of how the Vandals rose from obscurity to challenge the power of Rome itself. To understand how the Vandals became one of the most feared forces in the late Roman world, we must first look at their origins. Unlike the Huns, whose sudden emergence struck terror across Europe, the Vandals had been part of the Roman world for centuries, on the fringes, yet always present, always moving. The first mentions of the Vandals come from Roman and Greek historians, who described them as a Germanic tribe originating somewhere in what is now Poland. But the Vandals were not a single unified people. Like many so-called barbarian groups, they were a confederation of clans, loosely connected, constantly shifting alliances, and always on the move. By the 3rd century AD, pressure from other migrating tribes, as well as the expansion of Rome itself, had forced the Vandals southward. They crossed the rivers that had once been Rome's natural barriers, the Oder, the Elbe, the Danube, until they found themselves at the empire's doorstep. The Romans, at first, saw them as little more than raiders, a nuisance to be dealt with like any other tribe. But in time, the Vandals would prove that they were far more than just a passing threat. For centuries, the Vandals lived in the shadow of Rome, sometimes fighting against it, sometimes serving as mercenaries in its legions. But everything changed in the early 5th century. The year was 406 AD. On a bitterly cold winter night, the Rhine River froze solid, a rare event that would have seemed like a divine omen to those who witnessed it. Across the ice, an army of barbarians swarmed into Roman Gaul. Among them were the Vandals, along with their allies, the Alans and the Suebi. It was chaos. The Romans, stretched thin by internal strife and external wars, could not stop the invasion. The Vandals swept across Gaul, looting and pillaging as they went. By 409 AD, they had reached the Pyrenees, the mountains that separated Gaul from Spain. And there, they did something remarkable. Instead of merely raiding, they settled. They carved out territories for themselves in Roman Spain, with the Hastingi Vandals taking control of Galicia in the northwest and the Silingi Vandals claiming lands in the south. For a moment, it seemed as if they had found a home, but fate had other plans. If history remembers the Vandals, it is because of one man, Gaiseric. Born around 389 AD, Gaiseric was the son of a Vandal noble. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was not merely a warrior. He was a strategist, a thinker, a man who understood that brute strength alone would not be enough to secure a future for his people. When his brother, Gunderic, died in 428 AD, Gaiseric became king, and he inherited not just a throne, but a problem. The Vandals' position in Spain was becoming untenable. The Visigoths, now serving as Rome's allies, were pressing down on them. To stay would mean to fight a war they might not win. So Gaiseric made a decision that would change history. He would abandon Spain. He would lead his people, men, women, children, warriors, and elders, across the sea to a new land. A land of wealth, power, and opportunity. North Africa. In 429 AD, Gaiseric and his Vandals set sail from Spain. The exact number of ships and warriors is debated, but estimates suggest that anywhere from 15,000 to 80,000 people made the journey. This was not a raiding party. It was an entire nation on the move. At the time, North Africa was one of the most valuable provinces of the Roman Empire. It was the breadbasket of Rome, providing grain to feed the population of the imperial capital. But it was also vulnerable. The Roman governor of Africa, Boniface, was in open rebellion against the imperial government. Some sources suggest that Boniface may have even invited the Vandals to North Africa as allies before realizing too late the danger he had unleashed. Whatever the truth, Gaiseric wasted no time. The Vandals landed in Mauritania, modern Algeria, and immediately began their march eastward toward Carthage, the richest city in Africa. What followed was a campaign of brutal efficiency. The Vandals moved like a storm, sweeping through the countryside, defeating Roman forces, and striking fear into the hearts of those who opposed them. Cities fell one by one: Carthage, Caesarea, Salde, and Sidiphis. By 430 AD, they had reached Hippo Regius, one of the most important cities in Africa. There, they laid siege to the city, cutting off supplies and waiting for it to starve. Inside the walls was one of the most famous figures of the early Christian church, St. Augustine. As the siege dragged on, Augustine fell ill and died. His death was seen by many as a sign that Rome's time in Africa was coming to an end. And they were right. The city eventually fell, but Carthage remained untouchable. For now, by the early 430s, Gaiseric and his Vandals had established themselves as a major power in North Africa. But they were not done yet. The Roman Empire, though weakened, was still a force to be reckoned with. And Gaiseric knew that if he wanted to secure his people's future, he would have to do more than just raid and pillage. He would have to build. He would have to turn the Vandals from a wandering tribe into a true kingdom. And that meant taking Carthage. The greatest challenge was yet to come, but Gaiseric had already proven that he was no ordinary king. The world would soon learn just how dangerous a Vandal with a vision could be. This is just the beginning of the Vandal story. In the next chapter, we will witness the fall of Carthage, the rise of a Vandal navy, and one of the most infamous events in history, the sack of Rome itself. The empire thought it could contain the Vandals. It was wrong. The siege of Hippo and the birth of the Vandal kingdom. The flames of war had reached the shores of North Africa. The Vandals, once nomadic warriors wandering the edges of the Roman world, had now transformed into a force that threatened the very foundation of Rome's power in Africa. But their conquest was not yet complete. One city stood in their way: Hippo Regius. This was no ordinary city. It was one of the great metropolises of the empire, a center of trade, learning, and faith. It was also home to St. Augustine, one of the most revered theologians of the time. If Hippo fell, it would send a message across the empire. Rome was no longer invincible, but the Romans would not surrender without a fight. Their forces, though weakened, still held the city, determined to resist the barbarian tide. And so, in 430 AD, the Vandals laid siege to Hippo, setting the stage for one of the most pivotal battles in the fall of Rome's African territories. This was not just a war for land. This was a war for survival. For the Romans, it was a desperate attempt to hold on to what remained of their crumbling empire. For the Vandals, it was a battle to prove they were more than just raiders. They were the future rulers of North Africa. This is the story of the siege of Hippo and the birth of the Vandal kingdom. By 430 AD, Gaiseric and his Vandals had carved a path of destruction across North Africa. Cities had fallen. Roman defenses had crumbled, and the empire's grip on the region was slipping. But despite their victories, the Vandals still faced a major challenge. The Roman authorities in Africa, though weakened, were regrouping. They still controlled several key cities, including Carthage, the most valuable prize of all. But before Gaiseric could even think about taking Carthage, he had to deal with another stronghold: Hippo Regius. Why Hippo? The answer was simple. Hippo was not just a city, it was a symbol. Located in modern-day Algeria, Hippo was a hub of commerce and politics, second only to Carthage in importance. It was also a spiritual center, home to St. Augustine, one of the most influential Christian figures of the age. If Gaiseric could take Hippo, it would send shockwaves throughout the empire. And so, the Vandal army marched eastward, their eyes set on the city that would determine the fate of Africa. Inside Hippo's towering walls, tension was mounting. The people knew what was coming. For months, refugees had poured into the city. Romans fleeing from the Vandal advance, soldiers retreating after failed battles, and civilians desperate to escape the horror of war. They brought with them tales of destruction. Cities burned, families torn apart, Roman legions slaughtered. But Hippo was not defenseless. Its walls were strong, its garrison prepared. Supplies had been stockpiled, and soldiers patrolled the battlements day and night. Governor Boniface, the Roman commander in Africa, had positioned his best troops in the city, knowing that if Hippo fell, Africa would be lost. And at the heart of it all was St. Augustine. By this time, Augustine was an old man, frail but wise. He had spent his life preaching about faith and morality, guiding the people of Hippo through both spiritual and political turmoil. Now, As the Vandals gathered outside the city, he faced his greatest test. Would God protect Hippo from destruction? Or was this invasion a punishment for Rome's sins? As the first Vandal scouts appeared on the horizon, Augustine and the people of Hippo prayed for salvation. But salvation would not come. Gaisaric's army arrived at the gates of Hippo like a storm. Unlike the Romans, who relied on heavily armored legions, the Vandals were fast, mobile, and relentless. They surrounded the city, cutting off supply routes and blocking any hope of reinforcements. For the Romans inside, the siege became a slow and agonizing struggle. Food and water grew scarce. Disease spread. Soldiers and civilians alike began to lose hope. But the Vandals had their own problems. Unlike a traditional Roman army, the Vandals were not used to prolonged sieges. They thrived in open battle, using speed and surprise to overwhelm their enemies. But taking a fortified city required patience, a quality that many of Gaisaric's warriors lacked. Still, the siege dragged on. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and then tragedy struck. Inside Hippo, the situation was growing desperate. The people were starving, disease was rampant, and morale was crumbling. But for many, the greatest loss came not from war, but from nature itself. St. Augustine was dying. At 75 years old, Augustine had lived through Rome's decline. He had witnessed the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD and had warned of the empire's moral decay. Now, as Hippo stood on the brink of destruction, he fell ill. For 3 agonizing months, Augustine lay in bed, listening to the sounds of war outside his window. He prayed for deliverance, but none came. On August 28, 430 AD, St. Augustine passed away. For the people of Hippo, it was a devastating blow. Their spiritual leader was gone, and the city's fate seemed sealed. For the Vandals, however, it was another victory, one that was symbolic rather than military. The death of one of Christianity's greatest thinkers during their siege only reinforced their power. And yet, despite their losses, the Romans did not surrender. After 14 months of brutal siege, Hippo finally fell, but it did not fall to a final Vandal assault. Instead, the Romans, exhausted and unable to continue the fight, made the difficult decision to abandon the city. Governor Boniface and the remaining Roman forces retreated, leaving Hippo to the Vandals. What happened next is debated by historians. Some accounts suggest the Vandals sacked the city, killing those who remained. Others claim that Gaisaric, understanding the value of Hippo, spared much of it and used it as a base for his future campaigns. What is certain is that with Hippo gone, the Vandals had taken a major step toward dominance in Africa. But Gaisaric's ambitions did not end there. His next target was Carthage, the greatest city in the west after Rome itself. The fall of Carthage would not just cement the Vandals as a dominant power, it would shake the entire Roman world. The siege of Hippo was more than just another battle in the long decline of Rome. It was a turning point. It showed that the Vandals were not just raiders, they were conquerors. It proved that Rome's hold on Africa was slipping, and it set the stage for one of the most dramatic events in history, the fall of Carthage. Gaisaric had won a great victory, but his ambitions were far from over. The world would soon learn that the Vandals were here to stay, and Rome would never be the same again. The fall of Carthage and the rise of the Vandal Empire. For centuries, Carthage had stood as one of the greatest cities of the Mediterranean. It had been the jewel of North Africa, a place of wealth, power, and history. From the time of the Punic Wars, when it stood as Rome's greatest rival, to its transformation into a key province of the empire, Carthage had been at the heart of Roman civilization. No one believed it could fall, but in 439 AD, the unthinkable happened. A barbarian army, led by a king who had defied all odds, marched on the city. This was not a raid. It was not a passing invasion. This was conquest. The Vandals, a people who had once been wanderers, who had fought their way across Spain and Africa, now set their sights on the greatest prize of all. If they could take Carthage, they would not just be survivors of Rome's decline, they would be its conquerors. The empire was already in chaos. Its armies were stretched thin, its leaders divided. Gaisaric, the brilliant and ruthless Vandal king, saw his chance. He would take the city, reshape history, and carve out an empire that would shake the foundations of the Roman world. This is the story of how the Vandals did the impossible. This is the story of the fall of Carthage. After the fall of Hippo Regius in 431 AD, the Vandals did not stop. For nearly a decade, Gaisaric consolidated his power in North Africa. His warriors, once scattered nomads, had become a disciplined and fearsome force. His people, once wanderers, had begun to settle. The Vandals were no longer just raiders, they were rulers. But ruling was not enough. Gaiseric had bigger plans. He understood that survival in the ancient world required more than just military strength. It required wealth, resources, and political leverage. And there was only one place in North Africa that could give him all of those things: Carthage. Carthage was more than just a city. It was the second richest city in the Western Roman Empire. After Rome itself, it was the heart of Rome's grain supply, feeding the empire with the riches of Africa. It controlled trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean, linking Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Whoever controlled Carthage controlled power itself. And yet, Carthage was vulnerable. The Western Roman Empire was collapsing under its own weight. While the emperor and his generals fought endless wars in Gaul, Hispania, and the Balkans, Africa was left unprotected. Gaiseric saw what the Romans did not. This was his moment. In October 39 AD, Gaiseric made his move. But he did not attack Carthage like a common warlord. He did not lay siege, nor did he waste time trying to starve the city. Instead, he used deception. Ancient sources speak of a stratagem, a trick that allowed the Vandals to enter the city before the defenders could react. Some believe that Gaiseric used spies to infiltrate Carthage, bribing guards and opening the gates from within. Others suggest that his official status as Dux, a Roman military title granted in a previous treaty, allowed him to enter the city under the pretense of diplomacy. Whatever the method, the result was the same. The Vandals took Carthage without a fight. The city, unprepared for an attack, fell into their hands almost immediately. What happened next would shock the world. When the Romans realized what had happened, it was already too late. The streets of Carthage, once bustling with merchants and scholars, were now filled with warriors. The great markets, once the center of trade in the empire, were plundered. The palaces of Roman officials were stripped bare. But unlike the mindless destruction the word Vandal would later come to imply, Gaiseric did not destroy Carthage. He took it for himself. Rather than burn the city, he purged it. Roman elites were driven out, Nicene Christian leaders were stripped of power, and the Vandal nobility replaced Roman aristocrats. But the true prize was not gold or land. It was the Roman fleet. Carthage had been the base of Rome's North African navy. By capturing the city, Gaiseric had done more than seize a capital. He had become a naval power, and with that power, he would change history. News of Carthage's fall sent shockwaves through the Roman world. In Rome, the Emperor Valentinian III was in disbelief. No one had expected the Vandals to take the city. No one had believed Gaiseric was capable of such a bold move. The Western Roman Empire was already crumbling. It had barely survived the Visigothic sack of Rome in 10 AD. Now, with Carthage gone, it faced an even greater threat. Without Africa, Rome lost its main source of grain. Without its fleet, it lost control of the Mediterranean. Rome was starving, and Gaiseric knew it. Desperate to take back Africa, the Romans launched a massive counteroffensive in 40 AD. A joint force from the Eastern and Western Roman empires gathered in Sicily, preparing to invade North Africa and reclaim Carthage. The army was strong, the fleet was powerful, victory seemed certain. But then, disaster struck. Before the invasion could begin, the Huns attacked the Eastern Empire. With their forces stretched too thin, the Romans were forced to abandon the campaign. The invasion of Africa was cancelled. Gaiseric had won. Carthage, the greatest city in the West after Rome itself, now belonged to the Vandals. With Carthage secured, Gaiseric declared himself king of the Vandals and Alans. His people, once scattered refugees, were now the rulers of a kingdom that stretched across North Africa. But ruling was not enough. Gaiseric wanted to dominate the Mediterranean. Using the Roman fleet he had captured, he launched a series of naval raids across the empire. His ships struck Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and even the coasts of Italy and Greece. Rome had always controlled the seas. Now, the Vandals did. Unlike other barbarian groups who sought to blend with Roman culture, the Vandals did the opposite. They established Arian Christianity as the dominant faith, persecuting the Nicene Christians who had once ruled Carthage. They reorganized the economy, redirecting trade to benefit their new kingdom. They ruled not as Romans, but as Vandals, and the world took notice. For the first time, a barbarian kingdom was not just surviving in the ruins of the empire, it was thriving. The fall of Carthage was a turning point. It showed that the Roman Empire was no longer untouchable. It proved that the Vandals were more than just raiders. They were here to stay. But Rome would not forget this humiliation. Years later, the empire would try once again to take back Africa. It would launch one of the largest invasions in its history, and Gaiseric would face his greatest challenge yet. Would the Vandal kingdom survive? Or would Rome finally take its revenge? The sack of Rome manned the height of the Vandal Empire. Rome, for over 1,000 years, it had stood as the beating heart of Western civilization. It had endured wars, betrayals, and invasions. It had seen emperors rise and fall, generals march in triumph, and legions enforce its will across the known world. But in 455 AD, something happened that shook the empire to its core. A fleet of warships appeared off the coast of Italy. The banners they carried were not Roman, nor were they those of the Goths or Huns. They belonged to a new power, one that had risen from the fringes of history to challenge the empire itself. These were Vandal ships. At their helm was King Gaiseric, the man who had taken Carthage, built a naval empire, and now sought to strike at the very heart of Rome. He had waited for this moment, planned for it, and now, the opportunity had arrived. Rome had betrayed him. Rome had broken its promises. Now, he would make them pay. The sack of Rome in 455 AD was not just another raid. It was the ultimate statement, a message that the empire's time was ending, and the Vandals were now masters of the Mediterranean. This is the story of how the unthinkable happened. This is the story of how the Vandals sacked Rome. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was little more than a shadow of its former self. Its armies were depleted, its provinces rebellious, and its leadership in turmoil. Emperor Valentinian III, desperate to maintain control, had spent years navigating political intrigue, assassinations, and betrayals. But in 454 AD, he made a fatal mistake. He murdered Flavius Idius. Idius had been Rome's last great general, the man who had defeated Attila, the Hun at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. Without him, Rome was vulnerable. Just 6 months later, Valentinian III himself was assassinated. With no strong leader, the throne fell to Petronius Maximus, a man with no real power, no military backing, and no claim to legitimacy. To secure his rule, he made a desperate move. He forced Empress Eudoxia, the widow of Valentinian III, to marry him. It was a disaster. Eudoxia was furious. She despised Maximus and sought revenge. And so, she sent a message to Carthage. A message to Gaiseric. When Gaiseric received Empress Eudoxia's plea for help, he knew that this was his moment. For years, Rome had tried to undermine him. They had broken treaties, plotted against him, and sought to take back Carthage. Now, he would take the fight to them. In the spring of 455 AD, he assembled his fleet. Hundreds of warships, loaded with thousands of Vandal warriors, set sail from Carthage. The target was clear, Rome itself. As the fleet approached Italy, panic spread. The people of Rome had not forgotten what had happened in 410 AD. When the Visigoths under Alaric had sacked the city. But Alaric had left after 3 days. What would the Vandals do? Would they burn the city to the ground? Would they slaughter its people? Fear gripped Rome. And that fear turned into chaos. As news of the approaching Vandal fleet reached Rome, Emperor Petronius Maximus panicked. He had no army to defend the city. The people despised him. His own guards refused to fight for him. So, he did what cowards do. He tried to flee. Dressed as a commoner, Maximus attempted to escape Rome before the Vandals arrived, but the people saw him. Furious at his betrayal, they turned on him. Maximus was stoned to death in the streets by his own people. Now, Rome was leaderless, and the Vandals were coming. With no emperor, no army, and no leadership, Rome's citizens turned to one man, Pope Leo I. 3 years earlier, Leo had convinced Attila the Hun to spare Rome. Now, he would try again. As the Vandal fleet landed at Ostia, Rome's main port, Leo rode out to meet Gaiseric. What was said between them is unknown, but one thing is clear. Gaiseric made a promise. He would not burn Rome. He would not slaughter its people, but he would take everything else. On June 2nd 455 AD, the Vandals entered Rome. Unlike the Visigoths in 410 AD, who had spent 3 days looting, the Vandals took their time. For 2 full weeks, they stripped Rome of its treasures. They looted the imperial palace. They ransacked the temples. They emptied the great Roman treasury. They even took the fabled treasures of Jerusalem, the sacred artifacts that had been brought to Rome after the destruction of the Second Temple of the Romans centuries earlier. But the greatest prize was not gold, it was people. When the Vandals left, they did not go empty-handed. They took thousands of Roman citizens as captives, senators, nobles, and even the imperial family. Among them was Empress Eudoxia and her 2 daughters. For Gaiseric, this was more than just plunder. It was revenge. Rome had betrayed him. Now, he had Rome's own empress as his prisoner. With their ships overflowing with treasure and captives, the Vandals sailed back to Carthage, leaving behind a city that had been stripped bare. Rome had not burned, but it had been humiliated. With the sack of Rome, Gaiseric and the Vandals reached the height of their power. They controlled North Africa, the Mediterranean trade routes, and now had Rome's greatest treasures. No force in the Western world could challenge them, but Rome was not done yet. In 468 AD, the Eastern Roman Emperor Leo I launched one of the largest military campaigns in history. With over 1,100 ships and 100,000 men, he attempted to take back Carthage and destroy the Vandals. It was a colossal failure. Gaiseric, using fire ships, destroyed much of the Roman fleet. The invasion collapsed, and Rome was forced to make peace. The Vandal kingdom remained undefeated. For nearly 2 decades after the sack of Rome, the Vandals ruled the Mediterranean as an unchallenged naval empire. But no kingdom lasts forever. In 477 AD, Gaiseric died at the age of nearly 90. One of the longest reigning kings of the ancient world. Without his leadership, the Vandal kingdom began to weaken, and in 533 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, under Justinian and General Belisarius, launched a final war to take back Africa. The Vandal kingdom fell, but their legacy remained. They had defied Rome, they had built an empire, and they had changed history forever. This was the rise and fall of the Vandals, a story of ambition, betrayal, and the last great barbarian empire.